Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I am just going to begin with our last concluding session here. It's kind of nice as a landscape person to be flanked by architecture. And as I learned yesterday, landscape architectural history and landscape history is actually more avant-garde than I had thought. Our two speakers this afternoon are Jorge Civati, who is the Nelson Robinson Jr. Professor of Architecture here at the GSD, a very well-known architect. Most of you, I'm sure, I don't really need to introduce our two speakers here, but I'm going to do very briefly nevertheless. So Jorge chaired the architecture department from 1995 to 2002, and also teaches design studios besides his very busy practice. He lectures on history, on contemporary theory and criticism. And John May, who's sitting here to my right or left, depending on where you're looking from, is co-director of the Master and Design Studies program at the GSD and a founding partner of Millions, a Los Angeles-based design practice with projects in California, New York, and Beirut. And his work has been exhibited widely. So the prompt for this afternoon is, I'm going to just quote Antoine here, should we rethink the relationships among lecture, courses, seminars, and studio? And maybe I will just add, why are many history classes taught on Friday afternoon?
That's a good question. I'm going to go first. We are reversing the order. My talk is going to be very different. I think John's too. Obviously, we are the first to come from the other side of what we do at the GSD. With a big audience on the history theory field, although we are not strangers to that. And I am going to end with some concrete example of what we are trying to do in responding to Antoine's question. I start this session with a premise that I want to share with you and hope you all agree with me. And one is that history and theory has its own life at the school, and it's very good, and it's evolving on its own problematics, and really has all the right to worry about the ontology of the chair. What we are interested in, I think, today is what part of what history theory does here matters in an architecture school and in what ways we can use it. Okay? So that's, I'm looking at what... and I'm going to present three separate pieces with different narrative styles, and the only thing that connects them, unfortunately, is autobiography. But I guess there is no other way for me to do this. The first is anecdotal and very short, and I'm going to tell a story that some of you know very well because you've heard it from other people. I was an architecture student in Argentina in the 60s. That's really a remote place in the world. And I had standard survey courses with a book, a manual really, which was Pessner's book. That was what we read, translated into Spanish, with a special chapter added only in the Spanish-speaking version, which was written by somebody else on Spanish architecture, because Spain really didn't exist in the European canon at that time. However, and that was kind of boring, I did receive from one of my teachers a recommendation to read, translated into Spanish very quickly after publication and was already circulating, Whitcover's book. And another friend who spoke and read very well good English, I didn't, also recommended that I read the two articles of Colin Rowe in the Architectural Record, I think it was, or
Was it Perspective?
no, Architectural Review, which I still have actually, and I did not read English, so I read with cover, and I made quite an impression as an architect, and I looked at Colin Rowe, and I learned more or less what it was saying by looking at the drawings and comparing Palladio and Le Corbusier, Villagage, and the villas of Palladio. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I say that is what I take from my studies in history that really had an impact in me and changed my idea of how history was not only interesting, but could actually be useful and indispensable for the development of a designer. My question is that, is it possible to think in this way that there might be products coming from the field of history and theory that could do that again? And I'm leaving like that. I'm going to go to a more substantial and longer second part, which is a historical narrative that also has me as one participant. In the format of an evolving charge, it is a compressed and partial representation of the history and theory field at the GSD. And I hope you see that I am telling that story with me and two other even more important people as central to the generation of the process that puts in motion the development of the field of history and theory and at the GSD, and it is because there is no other way to avoid autobiographic information when you are a protagonist. That history started with a very specific charge, that of differentiating the role of history theory at the GSD from that other one that was well established at Harvard, the program of architectural theory and fine arts. It is not fine arts anymore.
No.
Okay, well, but you know who I'm talking about. The fog, as we used to say, the fog across the street. It should be specific as part of the education of a professional. This is the history that directly lays out the origin and evolution of the conditions that bring us all together around this table, all these history, theory faculty, both guests and GSD faculty, PhD aspirants and candidates around, and all the interested other faculty and students. Of course, other circumstances and protagonists would have perhaps produced a comparable situation, but we only have one history at a time. And for my 15 minutes worth, I'm going to summarize it as best as I can from how I'd live it through it. At the time, the law of modern architectural history in the United States had it that it started at Harvard with Gropius, etc., all the things you know, and that because of that, the presence of history at the GSD was nil, if non-existent. And it is not quite true. You all know that, but to question that and present a fairer history of how the history of architecture was part or not of the making of the GSD is not the topic today, not my forte. But what I want to talk about then is, unashamedly, what happens since the day I arrived to the school in 1975. And we can start with my chart. You can do full screen. And how do I operate this? From here?
Just forward.
Forward is what this. Yeah. When I arrived at the GSD, it was a school that had lost, frankly, its identity. After a retirement of Jose Luis Sert, this school really plunged into, frankly, a mediocre school, only living on its laurels. And again, that's not the story I'm going to make it today, but it will be worth writing that one day. A tiny but very influential minority among the faculty, and I must say they were all Europeans, felt the school needed fresh blood and sensed that Harvard needed, oh my God, to be competitive, because it was not. This meant for architecture at the time that somehow it should consider the introduction of what's emerging as theory, and I was hard to do that. This is the time in which, it was the beginning of the impact that the Institute in New York was beginning to have in architecture. I think there were 2 issues of oppositions out by the time. So something was brewing, and something felt the need for that. This meant for architecture at that time that sometimes that's what I just read, I'm sorry. But there was no talk about history, of making any change in history. The idea was to introduce theory to the school. What I brought had direct roots, was what I knew, in structuralism and post-structuralism in terms of more pure theory, as well as Italian developments in architectural history and theory, a field that they could claim at that point as their unique own, and then major connections of all that with the most advanced design work of the time, which was agreed was happening in England and in the USA. The other elements important to remark is that this was happening in a departmental context led and basically populated by practicing architects, but in a school led by a publicly declared antagonist of architecture, dean, who had been brought here by Mass Hall from the business school. In these conditions, we had half a scholar teaching history, because the other half was in the college, and his office, in fact, was at Carpenter Center. That's it. That was the GSD in 1975. The rest were all practitioners teaching design studios and some side interests like vernacular architecture courses in the vein of Rudowski, some behavioral science derivative of how to make architecture more responsive to people's needs, very naive approach, and some advocacy planning technology applied to the design. Overall, decisions on these junctions were still the domain of practicing architects teaching at the school. As an institutional crisis developed, a very serious one, and the dean, fortunately, was kicked out, new people was brought, and it was by the firm determination of Jerry McHugh, the new chair of architecture and immediately soon to be dean, and of Harry Cobb as chair a little bit later, 2 practitioners, that the decision was made to drastically change the composition of the faculty by bringing full-time historians both at the tenure and junior faculty levels and amplify the field of theory. I got the charge to develop as an assistant professor in my second year, the first theory course required in the core program and in the whole school for that matter. Some have told me that that was the first theory course of the new era of theory in the USA. I'm not sure it's true because it's hard to prove that, but some people insist that it was. There was fear, though, to use the word theory, believe me, which nonetheless was used freely in all discussions, and the course was named, without my consent, and to my surprise, Approaches, in plural, to Architecture. And that's how we started. I should point out that there was an implicit understanding that while the field of history will be carried by trained proper historians, the field of theory would be carried by practitioners, period. Once the door was open, the tide became very high and steady, never seeming to web out. Oh, I'm pushing my computer, but it's not in my computer. There was a search run by us and the FOG, and I was part, even though I was a junior faculty, of that committee. And we brought Howard Byrne and kept the half of Segler here. And that was an immense change. I am only putting here tenure faculty members because I think that shows the serious commitment, and you will see how the chart evolves. But you should see that accompanying this were all the junior faculty and visitors that had not really existed before. So for each one that adds here, there will be 3, 4, or 5 more teaching history or theory. And then I was tenured, and I'm making the historians in black, strong bold, so we distinguish the equations, how they will vary over the years in 83. Let me I just lost my page. Yeah. Okay, here I am. So as you will see, we can make a lot of this chart. It will be interesting to analyze, for instance, the compositions of those search committees and the final selections, the list of innumerable visitors teaching history theory, and the many junior, as I was just saying, non-tenured faculty in those fields. But again, that's another story that I would like to continue as I amplify this chart that I just came up with last night. With this impetus, something very strong happened, and that was in 1998, a colloquium, and Michael, help me if I miss something. It was a non-public colloquium, not unlike this, to discuss how we could reform the teaching of architecture and theory at the GSD, and those were the participants. There was no recording, but one result. We created, that's not the result, but what we created, the result direct of this colloquium was the creation of building text and context. And that's a unique sort of event, I would say, in the history of pedagogy in the United States. It was conceived differently and very specifically than the way it has evolved. And I agree that it had to evolve, but it had a very distinctive characteristic at the beginning, which was that it was going to be it was not a survey, but a case-based course. One case per week. It was mostly going to be buildings, but some of the cases would be texts. And 2 days a week, like now, 1 hour and a half each. But one day the case will be presented by a historian. The other day of the week, the case will be presented again by a practicing architect. That worked for quite a few years. Well, not many, but quite very successfully. Howard Burns and I taught from antiquity to the Baroque included, and Michael and Wilfred Wang taught from the 18th century to modern. There were 12 cases, I think, a semester, and they were really only organized more or less chronologically, but without the need to tie them up in any way. They were independent cases, and they always started by the building, and they amplify, context, whatever was necessary, to really, in my case, try to recreate the process that led to, that was the force in the design of the building. Try to find all the forces that would converge, and that was really something that continued, and we kept on adding faculty because this never stopped, I'm sorry. We can see the years and how things started to change. I'm putting Rafael Moneo in parentheses because when he stepped out, he really became very part-time as he is now, and his participation really became very individual and based on what he does when he's here. We are pretty much at this point now, and at this meeting today. So I'm going to try to, I know I well past my time, so I'm going to say, this keeps on going to the first page, I'm sorry. What are the questions that I think emerge from that? And very important piece of information is discharged is the gradual but inexorable disappearance of the architect theoretician. That's a historical fact. I don't think it's something to do that we did or didn't do. While Eisenman, Rossi, Venturi, Colin Rowe undoubtedly, and a second generation in which I include myself, led the way, they are nowhere to be found in the last decade or so. Some things to noted as possible signs of change and reversal. These young ones around John Cameron, if he's around there, Andrew and others, who I believe are refocusing intellectual intensity into the making of objects with phenomenal understanding of the new techniques of production and new experimental approaches to link and make studio and theory history work to each other's benefits. And of course, this conference, as I said, many important provocative questions emerge also from this. And I'm going to pose only one. And I think it's because you are all here, what is the presence, role, and impact that this, one of the most developed and strongest PhD programs in the history and theory of architecture, has in the studio of the school today? In my opinion, nothing. I think it should have. From the studio perspective, we exist as if this PhD program didn't exist. I think it's a serious problem and a serious waste of resources and a very poor way of conceiving a program of that caliber in a school of professionals of this caliber. So there is something very wrong that I want to throw to the table. I have much more, like 2 more pages, but I think I passed well my time, and some of these things will come up. I just only wanted to talk about one experience with Erica last semester that I would recommend highly, because it seems to be a way that goes well with the times and goes well with the way the school is organized on how to integrate in an almost quote-unquote natural way the teaching of theory and history and the studio. And I'll talk to in the questions. I'm sure it's going to emerge, and I'll present that as an example. I'm stopping here.
Thank you very much, Jorge.
Okay, I'll try to address maybe some of the ways that I agree with everything Jorge said at the end, particularly around the sort of disappearance of a certain type within the field. So I'll try to build up to that. These you know, as I was coming out of school, these are the 2 unavoidable realities of my life, I mean, my generation. So the response to these among my generation has been, on my view, that it has bifurcated the practitioners. On the left-hand side, we have the overly sincere techno-environmental management wing of the field, which is deeply sincere, but we can get into some of the issues I've had with that over the years that I've tried to articulate. On the other side, there's a kind of cynical, ironic wing. These are not meant to be, I don't mean these to be critical categories insofar as I think both categories have produced some interesting work by people in my generation. But one of them is maybe, their sincerity is oftentimes misdirected. The other one seems structurally incapable of seriousness at this point. And so I wonder at what point they will become adults, or how, actually. I don't actually know how they'll do that. From the beginning, my research, I'm not a historian, I'm not trained in architectural history. Anything I've done has been to try to find a politics. So I had read David Foster Wallace in undergrad. If you haven't read this, it's the most devastating takedown of irony in our lifetime, by the greatest ironist of our lifetime. So it made a politics of irony impossible in my generation. If it was possible in the previous generation to be ironic and critical, it's impossible in my generation to be ironic and critical. And so that was off the table, and so this is what was on the table, which is the politics of environmentalism and how that's incorporated into our field. And so my time my time spent completing a dissertation in geography and environmental studies at UCLA right after I finished my MArch here was to really look into these kinds of images, because it seemed to me that these kinds of images were how we were supposed to have a politics in architecture for my generation. And that involved looking into the history of thermometers and electrical resistance thermometers, and then moving up into satellite bolometers and how energy is chopped into images. And of course, I came across diagrams like this, which we saw yesterday. And as I talked about on Wednesday, and I think some of you were there, how we build up a kind of theory of electrical images, and how those electrical images are not only historically rich in their constitution and their emergence, but how they are fundamentally different from something like a photograph. And so in a lot of ways, my own politics has been a politics of the electrical image. And I've been trying to say that for about 10 years. Part of that has been involved, and this is where I get into questions of pedagogy, is how do you start to teach something like that to architecture students? So about 6 years ago, Zeynep Çelik-Alexander and I founded the Instruments Project at University of Toronto through a generous grant from the Canadian government. And this really was meant to, we split up, we have 8 collaborators, we gave them all a technical gerund. Some, as you saw, Lucia was studying rendering, Michael Osmond studying specifying, et cetera, imaging, scanning. These were, I set those categories, and I set them because I wanted to have some of my smartest historian friends spend time studying the deep history of the buttons that my students were pushing every day on their computer screens. Because I'm convinced that that is a rich direction for architectural theory. And so we've published some texts, held many events over the past 5 or 6 years. Most of them were closed-door workshops. And if I would say one thing to the architects in the room is, if you want historian collaborators, get some money. Because it's a great way to bring people together, get some grant money, and set up workshops. As I showed the other day, my goal has been to understand the relationship between two images like this. So what happens to architecture, if it's a sort of vision of the world and a fact in the world at the same time, then we live in this culture of electrical images, and I think that it's inevitable that our practices, I think, to a large extent, have already been absorbed by that culture. If you need any further evidence, as I said the other day, that we live in a politics of the electrical image, this is our current president. And one of the things I pointed out the other day, one of the ironies of the politics of electrical imaging, is that the specific content of many of our images loses their meaning at the exact same time that imaging itself becomes the platform by which we give meaning to our lives. So I'll come back to this then briefly. The question then is what to do with this scenario. Well, one thing I've tried to do is insert a kind of category in between these, or beneath all of these. I was here, I'm remembering now, 3 or 4 years ago, and I talked about the conjoining of these two images, and the way in which the image on the left, the emergence of the open jury system stimulated, I think, in many ways, the emergence of post-war architectural theory, because it really forced architects to articulate their ideas. I see in my time, and this is my first pedagogical remark, I think in my time the jury has lost its capacity to stimulate that kind of response. I think it's become a bit formulaic. It's become a kind of strategic game that students learn to play relatively early on. And not only that, it has unintentionally placed discourse before objects rather than alongside objects, which is to say that students generally have a discursive defense for their objects before they have an object, right? So that was an unintentional consequence of the open jury system. So that's the kind of first institutional rearrangement that I would talk about in terms of pedagogy. How do we begin to, it certainly doesn't call for a wholesale rejection of the jury, but maybe an expansion of it, a redefinition of it, opening up other avenues of evaluation within studio culture. This image, I actually had it in my slide before Antoine made his point this morning, but I also think that we can point to the disappearance of theory along other lines as well. And this is, this is just one image. This is David Harvey's, an image from his condition of postmodernity, and this is his diagram of labor under what he called flexible accumulation, which is essentially neoliberalism. I'm generalizing right now. But you can see how one of the things that gets made flexible in neoliberalism is labor. And the experience of my lifetime in teaching, I've been teaching about 8 years, and I've taught at, I think, 7 schools. And usually multiple schools at the same time, which generally I fly about 100,000 miles a year. And that I think maybe extreme in that category, but I think there are many people who are taking that on as a reality. And so I think that's a very real institutional reality, because one of the things that happens in that condition is that it becomes extremely risky to take risks. It's not just about taking a risk within an institution anymore, it's about taking a risk, it's about taking a kind of existential risk to a certain extent. And then the other thing I would say is that within that kind of labor market, what has happened, I think, unintentionally within the sphere of the scientific research university and the tenurial system and the demand for demonstrations of expertise within that system is that essentially what we have in many ways now are 2 acceptable forms of expertise within a kind of hiring stream. And one side absolutely should be and is the professional historian, which absolutely needs to be preserved as a tenurable thing within schools. On the other hand, there are certain acceptable categories for hiring designers, and at least in my generation, those tend to be people, as Jorge said, that are excessively dedicated to practice and relatively uninterested in theory. I was talking with Scott the other night. I said, if in your generation it was somewhat shameful to say you hadn't read Derrida, in my generation it's relatively shameful to admit that you do. And I think, so I just want to end on this, which is, I agree. I agree. When I was here as a student, Jorge would give the introductions oftentimes to lectures, and they were extremely well written and eloquent and dedicated to the material that they were very generous to the person who was coming in. So I think that's something that I'm using Jorge. I'm using you as a figure here for the disappearance of a certain type, I think, in architecture schools, and that's troubling, I think.
I just want to say one thing that you mentioned and I was going to talk about, but I think it is important just to complete the picture of these conversations, is that in parallel to this, we should also be discussing the future and how to reconfigure studio teaching today. I think, it's not only the jury, is the system. I don't think it's working as well as it used to, just to put it mildly. Anyway, that's all, because
I think incidentally, one thing I neglected to mention is something like the work we've been trying to do for 5 or 6 years through that collaborative research project, and I see some of my seminar students here now. The purpose of some of those is to try to insert a kind of research project between history and studio, to find to find conversations that those separate, those now somewhat siloed groups can actually have. So, yeah.
Can I?
I'm not suggesting that Technics is the only one.
Yeah.
Just before we get, because I agree with talking about the future, but can we talk about the...
Just to pass a bit more, and maybe I could get some help to briefly fill this out, that it was very important, I think it's important to point out that Jorge's approaches to architecture, the syllabus, like the first 2 readings, was Claude Lévi-Strauss's Structural Study of Myth, and Roland Barthes' Pleasure of the Text was right up there. I remember. Cameron's nodding. Like really, really early. They were foundational, and I think there was a sense. There was certainly a sense when I sat in on it. I was at MIT, but I sat in on it. That the idea of a kind of, and I'm using this in a generic way, a deep structure. That the idea that systems of meaning had a kind of deep structure that that and the development of a discipline, whether it was, poetry or architecture, had to do with sort of re-originating certain problems that were not problems of reference in the real world, but there were problems in poetry. It was a poetic problem. And in architecture, it was an architectural problem, not something that had reference. So you worried about how many ways can you make an interior corner that acknowledges the thickness of the wall, right? Or how do you develop a French hotel into a free plan? You worried about those deep structural things. And so I think in a way I'm beginning to think, I haven't thought this before, I'm sort of thinking this now, the relationship to history was, to the history of the discipline, was actually in some ways as important as having the theoretical mechanism, which basically was coming from structuralism and post-structuralism. But what happened was that need for history was probably also instrumental in forming postmodernism, which then literalized the relationship. Yeah. It literalized the relationship of history. Absolutely. And then as soon as that, it kind of flattened and exhausted it, and then immediately the problem, the digital problem came in, and everybody, all the good designers who used to be interested in history and theory ran to try to master technology.
Yeah. It was the moment of transformation, in the literal use of metaphor.
Yeah.
The idea that, and I think it was really more precisely, if I could point that out, one event, which was the deconstruction show at MoMA, in which, for the first time, I mean, a high, intense, philosophical concept and kind of conceptual armature to study, to develop critique, which was deconstruction, is interpreted literally. And so the constructive architecture is broken. And then it was followed by the fold, in which actually architecture was folding, facades and all. And that became the antithesis of any deep reading of anything.
Right.
And it becomes trivialized.
Right.
It's absolutely true. And that's the moment.
So, I just wanted to say about Jorge as a figure and the possibility of the architect as an intellectual, that as a young architect and academic scholar, I always feel in this split between the value of being an architect and the value of being a historian, theorist, and that our generation has somehow created a deeper gap between the education behind both fields, between practice and theory. And I wonder if your comments about the methodology in studio and how there is a certain separation between the theory teaching and the studio teaching, the advancements of a PhD, and I feel that very much in our generation, and I wonder why is the intellectual project of architecture that used to be carried by good architects who are able to construct a thought the way Monet did, the way you did, and that we don't find anymore, how is the education structure actually promoting that split?
Well, yeah, I mean, you point out that it is not. And again, I don't think it's anybody's fault, but I believe in the gap. I wouldn't blame your generation. I think it's the gap that has been created as the practitioners abandoned the production of theory, let's say, the active participation of that, and that seemed to have that to be a historical fact. There is this coincides with the changes in the market. I mean, theory evolves at the biggest economic crisis in the 70s, before the big crisis that we have gone through. So nobody had any work. Of course, the conditions existed with all these incredible upheaval after '68 in Europe in terms of a renewal of the whole intellectual apparatus of theory and all that. But the conditions of practice were very, very much, well, they were meager in terms of opportunities. So I think as you know, work came back, also that might have helped to take away practitioners from the teaching, although I cannot say that that's the only reason, but it did help. I think the gap is a serious problem between, in a way, the two sides of the table. I mean, as much as the efforts we make, there is now two very different discourses that are running in parallel. And what we did with Erica was actually not to try to sort of bridge that gap by trying to come up with one idea, but actually to play the parallel game and to do the same thing in parallel at the same time in the same semester. It's just a lot of things that converge. I was working on for years in a part of the world in which I was concentrating on an area that contains some amazing 17th and 18th century ruins in the middle of the jungle in South America. They're the Jesuit mission ruins. And I was working on the studio, and in the third studio, Erica was presenting her seminar on ruins, the aesthetic of ruins, which I knew the material and I thought it was terrific. And we talked about, and the new thing was not only to recommend, as I would have done to my students to take that course, but to actually require. And the school has never done anything like that. It's kind of anathema to require anything more than the required courses. But we were allowed to the, you know, the problem was created for Erica because she was not allowed to keep a 15 people seminar, but she had to add 12 more from my studio, but she did. And I have to say that, and I am an experienced design teacher, that I am, because I've been doing this for a long time. I've never seen results like that. It was not just that there were two things in parallel, and looking at the same thing, but from different perspectives and with different goals and different methodologies. It was multiplied because these Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, which were when these two courses took place, the students, and I have one sitting in front of me, were just living in this kind of arguments, stories, perspectives on the same topic, and reading different bibliographies and talking to different people. And we didn't really, it could be done much, much better, but we didn't because we did it at the last minute, frankly. It was a few weeks before the semester started. We just got permission to require my students to take that seminar. And the results just were, I think, explosive and phenomenal. And you could see that in the students, in their response, in the richness with which they really finally approached and produced, you know, the proposal, the design proposal. We are coming up with the publication of that with Erica, so you will be having it in a couple of months, I suppose. It's almost done. But I would recommend that format absolutely and without any reservation, that the idea of parallel courses that can focus on the same topic be required. I mean, for the studio students to take an accompanying seminar or workshop that comes from another perspective, because I think then, at least for what we have now, the actual bridging of the gap happens in the student's mind. and you just have to let that happen, and each individual to do the best they can with this accumulation, this intensity, this incredible focusing, you know, with that intensity on the same topic. So this was just amazing. I'm going to try to repeat it, obviously.
Are there other thoughts on how historians could contribute to design studio teaching? So we had the parallel teaching, we had the co-teaching.
Yeah, well, no, I don't have any concrete work. I have some fantasies in my mind, but I don't know if they're going to be useful. Let me think. Maybe we can hear other suggestions from others or some experiences that I have in terms of how today they can contribute. The thing is that, again, when the practitioners that we're teaching architecture or the purely design studio teachers, they were full-time people not practicing, but fully dedicated to the pedagogy of the studio, were very much immersed in history and theory at the time. Also, the historians and theoreticians were part of the studio life. I mean, that's what the thing, the fluidity was immense. It was just, it was there, it was a given, you know, and it's not anymore, that's the gap. But I think the bringing the historians and the theoreticians to the studio is one step. I don't know how the historians and the theoreticians can use us in their courses, but I do. I mean, I usually participate and given single lectures or presentations in seminars, but that's not very widespread or a practice that we really engage much.
I'm fearful that Jorge and I will dominate because we like talking about these things, but I do want to maybe shift the mood,
Yeah.
but also
There's something, when the theorists and the historians regularly went to like studio crits, which I still try to do. A lot of the problem is time.
Yeah.
You get specialized because you have a whole group of students, the PhD students, whom you're primarily responsible for, and the other students you do it when you can. However, for a historian, it's a bit like going to a pinup is like doing arpeggios. I mean, it keeps your eyes sharp. I really believe that you see more deeply and you see more quickly when you're practiced at doing pinups, but you also see trends that you can then use to interpret buildings. It makes you see your own work differently, and I think it is a shame. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is very real, and I'm hoping that some students can maybe respond to this. Despite the success and your excitement about the thing you did that you and Erica did together, my experience is that for the most part, the students find little attraction to the history courses. I don't know that.
But they're always full.
Well, they were required. And the only way you can, and they're not always full, Jorge. It's not. I mean, it kills me that Max Scoggin regularly comes into Buildings, Text, and Context and stands at the back because he enjoys it.
Yeah.
And that we can't get the students to stop doing their own
Can I make
online work.
one observation on that? I think one thing that has happened over, I don't know, 4 decades, is that there was a sensible object around which theoretical and political conversations could be had, and it was called the city. Mm-hmm. And then the city fractured into urbanism. And at this point, I think urbanism has sort of given way to imaging. That's obviously my position.
Yeah.
It's probably given way to many other things that other people could substitute in there. But I think one of the things that happens is when that shared platform for conversation essentially evaporates. Now I think it's increasingly difficult for an historian to come into studio without certain kinds of technical training. I think it's increasingly difficult for students to go into a history class that maybe doesn't address some of the actual things that are happening on their computer screens all day long. So, again, I'm not suggesting that technics is the silver bullet to anything, but I think that we have to find those kinds of topics.
Yeah, exactly.
Just one addendum to that, then I promise I'll stop. Add to that a kind of that is coupled with a kind of realism, which the artifice that architecture is, and the artifice that, if you understand it, is primarily a constructed discipline, a discipline that constructs and makes artifice, and you start to love that kind of manipulation, goes away when you think of architecture as a kind of realism that has reference in, that is primarily about reference, and it has an immediacy. I think that history, a love for history requires, it's not about being in the past, it's recognizing the constructedness and the artifice of that. I think a lot of students just they think architecture is like engineering, or it has an immediacy. And I think that's coupled with the technicity. So there's a kind of presentism that's also coupled with the technism.
Marika?
Go ahead. I'm just going to pass it on to Fallon pretty quickly, because that's exactly what I was going to say. I think the issue, I mean, something to really consider is when you tether, and I know you're not suggesting this, but there is an issue with tethering the practice of history to the interests of studio. You don't want one agenda to fold seamlessly into the other. You need friction there.
But there
it has
is.
it has to be absolutely anti-instrumental.
Yeah.
That relationship.
But here is the deal and the contract in a way. We do have a very special situation at Harvard, in which we do have a full department of architectural history across the street, and the contract, not in the legal terms, here. And the reason we have these amazing historians here is because that's made very, very clear during interviews and searches, is that they want to come here, not there, for a reason, which is to be part of a design school, and so they are part of the process of the making of architecture, not about purely scholarship. We demand also in each one of the searches that we take the Harvard standards and we take the top scholars. So they have to do their scholarly work uncompromising, and that's what I said at the beginning. History theory, should do what they should do on their own, as you are all doing in the PhD and in the research of faculty. But it is expected that they do participate in the education and the production of design in this school.
Well,
That's
let
why
me
the
make my
idea-
own
yeah.
position clear.
Yeah.
I'm a trained architect,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I am all for
Yeah.
collaboration. I think it's a shame, really a real shame, that we don't have more collaboration between the PhD
Sure.
students and the.
So I
design
agree with you
studios.
that it cannot be sort of diminished, the work of architectural historians and theoreticians by just bringing them down to an instrumental, as you say. No, that's not. But it's got to be a way, because otherwise there is no point in having this whole thing, with all these people around here thinking about the history and the theory of architecture.
So what I was gonna add into this blue stuff is that I've taught co-taught an option studio here with a practitioner of he's an architect trained here at the GSD, whose position at the time, he had become an urban designer, and his position at the time was the head of a planning department. Mm-hmm. And the two of us co-taught a studio in an American city. Mm-hmm. That was first of all, there had not been an option studio in an American city for some time, because how else are you going to pay for it? And we were blessed with the foundation that was willing to put up the funds. Mm-hmm. And in this instance, what I, as a scholar, historian, and a historian of the recent past, was bringing to the table was something that is not valued throughout the rest of the design studio space, which was a form of, in terms of whether you call it community engagement or participatory design or things of that nature, but those methodologies and what must kind of presage that as a intellectually before one goes delves into a project. And the vitriol, I mean, complete vitriolic speech that was thrown at us as instructors in 2013 is something that from both the students who said, I didn't come to the GSD for this. This is not what we do at the GSD. This is Option Studio. They've taken studios and taken seminars here, and at no point prior to their time at this point in time had they had that kind of exposure. And there's been light years of change in the past 3 to 4 years. I mean, light years. But I want to put that out there is that it's not just that students are coming in with a, especially kind of not our generation, but maybe another generation, with this kind of idea that this stuff history doesn't matter, or intellectual thought doesn't matter. It's also that it is being fostered by a set of practitioners who have disassociated discourse from other kinds of intellectual activity. And so I want to delve a little bit more into what is, while there may be the disappearance of the Jorges, there is now a preponderance of faculty in departments of architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning design departments that are active. They have active research agendas. They are actively involved in discourse, but they are not active participants in the valuing of the intellectual process. And so I just, those two things are not necessarily the same, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know, this is my perspective.
Yeah, he's right. I don't think that would really describe the GSD entirely. I mean, we have cases, but I do think that in general, the design faculty is very interested in the intellectual part. What they do and how they promote it and all that is another story, but I don't think that I see as a generalized antagonism, although I can agree, and I have my own knowledge of occasions in which you do get a practitioner teaching studio with that kind of attitude, yeah.
Can I ask if there's a way we could think more speculatively about, I suppose, exacerbating the distance between history and the studio in a certain way? The question that I have, or actually for the students and for my historian colleagues, is we keep saying history, theory, historian, theorist, and so on, and I assume that there's an implied shorthand, and all of you mean architectural historian and architectural theorist. Mm-hmm. But that to me is a question, because I actually refer to myself as a historian, and then I tell people I specialize in architectural history. But I try to actually maintain that larger category for myself of being a historian, and thinking that while I think through architecture and the built environment, I'm trying to answer historical questions and pursue historical questions. And so there are a set of colleagues that I see in a similar way. The gentleman next to me who's in conversation with Tony Grafton and so on, like historians, right? There's several people here who are in conversation with, not only do we have a history of art, but you have a history of art and architecture across the street, you have an actual history department across the other street, right? There's a real history department, and there's a history of science department. So my point about exacerbation is maybe I'd ask as a question, would it be more useful to you, John, to bring a historian, not an architectural historian, not an urban historian, but to bring a historian of science into your studio, recognizing the gap in language, like how do you talk to a group of students on a given day?
Yeah.
But in terms of thinking about this question of the relationship of history to studio, I wonder whether there's a benefit in not immediately assuming that we're talking about architectural history in studio or landscape architectural history in studio and urban history in studio. But we could start from asking what's the relationship between history and a professional practice.
Yeah, I think, it's an excellent point. I mean, I think, let's put it this way. I think you would need a parallel seminar. For example, my own bibliography in terms of the work that I've done is primarily history of science and technology, and obviously heavy on continental philosophy or something like that. But and many of those people do teach right around here, right? And so I think, could you bring a historian of science in for conversation? Absolutely. But if you simply pick them up and drop them into a studio context, that I don't think would play out very well. You have to have another forum, you have to have a seminar-style forum, I think, in which there is a conversation that's had maybe even the semester prior to some kind of conversation with them, in which the students have the adequate time to read their work and digest their work and understand their influences and their interlocutors and all of those kinds of things. I think it's a fascinating idea. But yeah, I mean, yes.
No, but Tim, I see your point. It's very clear what you said, and obviously there is not only no problem, but it should be welcome. The idea that you have great historians and historians of science, and why not bringing them here? But there is a difference between them and the rest of the humanities, if you want, sociologists, archaeologists, and people that we bring from it, and an architectural historian. And that's why we have architectural history in the school and not history. So there is a big difference, and I would then not understand why we want to create a gap between these two disciplines that are in the school that are specific about one topic, which is architecture. So I'm not sure I understand your proposal.
Well, I think what I'm trying to speculate on is whether the goal here of putting history in conversation with studio, and I have I have a background in that, I have respect for that, I recognize advantages, but just thinking theoretically here as a group, is the purpose of that to establish a fluency, or is the purpose of that to establish a body of questions? And if you're trying to introduce questions into studio, then I think many other historians would be better agents for that than many architectural historians. And if the point is to establish fluency, then I can see the merits of the architectural historian. And all I'm asking, I guess, is that we discriminate a bit among those categories and say that perhaps the architectural historians in the GSD or elsewhere are not fulfilling every purpose of history within the school, but
no.
that you think in terms of history as a certain kind of category of thought that could be producing a kind of density of questioning, and that in that case, an architectural historian may not be the right agent for you. And rather than feel disappointed in that, but we could feel some freedom in that as well, the ability to bring Grafton or Jill Lepore or whoever into a studio environment.
Esa?
I had a very specific question for John, which I'll come back to very, very quickly. I was very struck by your comment, and one thing that comes to mind is that, no, in a perfectly happy way. I mean, I'm grieved. But I think, and this goes back to something Jorge said, which is that my perception is that historian, and I guess as a historian I'm like 0.1 secular or something, but as a historian in the School of Architecture, you're largely a service provider, and that's fine. I mean, I trained very originally as being an art historian. I would never teach in an art history department in a million years. Love being in the School of Architecture. But we provide the history, and what your comment made me think is that in a School of Architecture, in a classroom, the students, they're not encouraged to appreciate the extent to which history itself is a craft and a design project. And they don't see the history coming into being. They just are delivered the results. This is what you need to know about history. So to the extent to which this historian goes to tons of pinups and is very engaged in the studio environment and understand how thought evolves in that environment, I'm not quite certain the extent to which some of the designers or students realize that we as historians work through problems and have our own design issues and craft techniques. But maybe I'm overstating the case. But John, very quickly, I love this category you had, the cynic ironic, the almost adult. And I'm gonna cover the microphone and call this the Emmanuel Petit factor. But what
I
about,
didn't say that.
that's why but what about, because I think you absolutely nailed a prevalent category in our important sociology in our field now. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'm going to do it without naming any names. I think it's a very. I think they are complementary, those two categories, which is to say that they have formed the false debate of my generation. They've formed the false debate by never having a conversation. And yet what they're both in agreement about is that they should be left alone. And so I find one of them to be anti-intellectual in that it's not curious about the history of its own methods, that, the sort of overly technocratic side. They sort of traffic in all of these images, and they don't actually care where any of the images come from. I know way more about where they come from than any of them. And so the idea that acumen equals knowledge, I mean, that's how we end up with supposed texts of architectural theory, which are nothing but user manuals for how to use Revit. I'll say Schumacher. Yes, I'll name that name happily. On the other side, the other side is deeply anti-intellectual in its own way, in that it's not cool to be serious in my generation. You're not invited to the party, and I'm never at the party. So there's extremes. Some schools are much more extreme in that sense than others, and I'm not saying that. I actually think it's more of a kind of unintended. Let's put it on a positive spin on it. It's, for many people, it's a survival mechanism. You fall into a camp because that's how you keep your job, and that's how you stay ingratiated to the people who will give you a job. Because in my generation, the critic has replaced the theorist, and the critic is not a theorist. The critic is someone who opens doors to museums and makes particular kinds of appeasing texts and writes particular kinds of appeasements to certain kinds of architects. And if you don't have that in your corner in my generation, then you're in trouble. So,
by the way, we see that kind of aesthetic of indifference even in undergraduate applications to a pretty sophisticated level. People arguing and sort of putting forth rhetoric to prevent them from showing anything of substance in their portfolios and stuff. It's really filtering down to an earlier stage. I want to say something about Timothy, this expansion of boundaries of historians versus the more conservative focus, the limiting or the expansion of our kind of discipline into other areas. There's a moment, I'm probably going to come down more on Jorge's side, but I think it's a question of timing. In the core, where you learn about the body of architecture, this kind of corpus, there's a moment in first year, which I can speak mostly about, where BTC, the kind of Baroque and Renaissance things of Michael and Erica, are congealing with things I'm doing in my descriptive geometry course about parallel and perspective projection, and also maybe the hidden room that deals with subject and object perceptions. And somehow these things aren't totally aligned, but like certain cylinders are kind of firing and things are reinforcing one another in their own ways. It seems to me that formal analysis, could be I'm not a historian, but I have an interest in the Baroque, but I deal with these precedents more as empirical things of close reading, although I would consider myself pretty knowledgeable about the form of Baroque churches. I'm not an expert on the Counter-Reformation or anything, like that. But
You took it very
what's that?
seriously, my
What's that?
critique of you.
Yes, Jorge's critiqued me about this in the past, but there's only so many hours in the day. It seems to me that kind of close reading and formal analysis of objects, this is something I've talked to Scott about, is conspicuously absent in the school. Something that I happen to be good at, but a kind of common ground, because I'm not a historian, but I can deal with historical objects and read them closely for all the syntax and richness that they have to offer. And as it relates to the studio work, I have found a disturbing lack of syntactical thinking and syntactical production in the studio work that I see up there, largely because there's agendas of option studio credits that come, but obviously largely due to the technology, the facility by which form is generated and quickly made. It is, even though it's deeply within the the software we use, it is absolutely eradicated from any kind of scrutable, perceptible vision of the subject to see it.
Ezra, and then to you.
Yeah, in looking for platforms where PhD students and studio students collaborate, or even perhaps faculty collaborate, I wonder where you see the status of curatorial studies in this question. And the reason I'm asking, I mean, of course, the changing status of the curator is a big problem, but we cannot perhaps deny the fact that more and more historians are doing exhibitions. And at one point, I was quite skeptical of this, and I used to tell myself I will never participate in an exhibition as a curator. I'll always participate as an artist. But then this term, I'm teaching a course where, a PhD course, where the students will produce an exhibition on an exhibition, and the master students or the studio students are teaming up with PhD students to make that exhibition, and making an argument spatially is actually, I mean, that's what an exhibition is, right? You make an argument spatially, and making an argument about history spatially brings out new avenues of that collaboration. And when I'm looking at how the team of students are working, I see that actually many students are doing historical research, and many of the PhD students are also doing the exhibition design. So it's not really, the collaboration is not necessarily working where everyone is bringing their own expertise, but actually the students are going outside of their comfort zones, and the studio students are really researching, or at least volunteering to do the research, and the PhD students are volunteering to do the exhibition design. So I wonder if curatorial studies, with all its problems, of course, is an area of worth thinking in generating this collaboration between the historian and the designer.
I was thinking about what you were saying, Ed, that you would never teach in an art history department. You would rather be here, and it made me wonder: is it because you are an ethnographer of architects? Are you being an ethnographer of architects? Like, is that are they the objects of your study? Is it a question of who your interlocutors are, or is it a question of what your material is? And here, of course, I'm thinking about what Michael is saying about looking at pinups, right? That's this material that informs you, which sort of leads me to the second question that I had, which is that perhaps it is the other way around. Perhaps it's not that we here doing history serve architects, but rather we are an excrescence of the field, this field of architecture. I mean, it's not a coincidence that many of the students in the PhD program came out of there, and I think that the history of this kind of program is that people training to be architects were asking questions that, to what Timothy was saying, were not being asked in history and in art history. And so I think it's the other way around. It's not really how we serve that, rather that we emerged from there, and we exist as this excrescence. We just do.
It's harsh.
There we go.
You're going to say something high, and you do it. No.
I just have just on a practical level. So, Cameron, I really like the idea of formal analysis as being one of these junctures. There is another one too that just on a very practical level that I've seen work really well, which is, how we know we need to rethink studio. We know we need to do it. Okay. To rethink studio. Yeah. But one thing from studio that actually works really well for history theory is the pinup. And I've actually taught graduate writing seminars and things like that based on the pinup model, where people actually do critiques of the kind of very creative critiques of writing and of kind of historical thought using the pinup model. So I think there's also, beyond the kind of larger questions of what what body of knowledge, what the relationships are between these different bodies of knowledge, there's also, I think, productive cross-pollinations of pure methodology that we might explore very productively. As, you know, we try to think of new, we try to be a little bit more creative about the position of architecture in the world at large.
I mean, this is a straightforward also issue. I wonder how many people in our PhD program would identify as history and theory versus just identifying as historians at this point. And I think that speaks partly to what Timothy was bringing up, is that I feel an enormous amount of pressure to deal with the metrics of historians as much as I do with architectural historians. So the idea of like talking about Witkover as anything more than an isolated object of a particular time, I think would be foreign to me. So I think there's a certain sense that I don't know if it's because we're professionalizing in another direction than the school is going or than architectural studios are going, but I think there's a whole other set of demands that maybe we've partially decided this is what we want to put on ourselves now, but the project itself that I even feel like I'm engaging in is one that crosses with studio at moments, but it has its own set of standards maybe that I think just that, and I think this is a generational shift that like people at the other end of the table have been part of pushing us a certain direction, and yeah, now I don't have anything more.
One of the reasons why we're discussing this, I think personally, is because we are distinguishing history and theory, and that need not be so. And so that moment when that occurred is a crucial moment for what we're seeing today.
Yeah.
So maybe that, you know, putting more thought and analysis into that moment. So thanks for bringing up that point. But Lane, and then we have Charlotte.
Sure, it's just my okay. Just my perspective as a master's student who's been a student of almost all of you. I think in studio, at least for me, like the thoughts that are like moving around in our mind are always thoughts that are coming from your courses and not from studio themselves. And I wasn't here for the morning, so I don't know if the question of like discipline and method were things that were talked about much, but I can't help but sit here and also wonder about like landscape history as something which is maybe separate or different from architectural history. And in your course presented a whole set of precedents and actual material for us to think about, and then ended. The course concluded with this kind of like fear or crisis about like what about not instrumentalizing that knowledge. And in John's course is certainly not an architectural history or theory course. So, and you said I think on the first day, you know, if you think this is going to help you as a designer, it's not.
I said it would. It just it wouldn't be. It's indirect, and,
sure.
and it's impossible to articulate the ways in which it will change how you think.
Mm-hmm. So and then
it's all going to be in your brain.
Yeah. And in Michael's course in BTC, we actually had to write about one of our projects as a with theory as a way of seeing our project. So I just as you're developing these this material, these syllabi for for design students, which of course design is history, theory, design is a third discipline. I don't know. Certainly, you're thinking about those. I don't know what my question is, but I just wanted to put that there. So.
But maybe it's related, if I may interject here, even though it's not my role. I mean, we need to have conversations across the disciplines, and we're talking a lot about architectural history, whereas I'm here as a landscape historian, and I also do environmental history, and we also have urban historians and urban design historians in the school, and so my plaidoyer actually for today, but I also want to hear what Charlotte wants to say before I close this, is that the designers ask us as historians to not necessarily serve them and as kind of a service in the real sense, but actually to come into their classes, invite us into your classes, but also let the students know that you consider history, theory, an important thing, because if we do not, I mean, this sounds a little needy, right? Obviously, but if you know, but this is where the power lies, because students are in the trays or in the studios for the maximum amount of time that they can spend here at the GSD, and considering or looking at how much time they spend in seminar and lecture classes, that's much less. So I think in a certain way there's a very kind of, whether we like it or not, there's a curious dependence here on the design professions to actually push history theory. So, but sure.
So just to introduce myself, I came in as a landscape architecture master's student, and then I decided to also add a degree in master's in design in the history and philosophy of design, which I have not yet started the coursework for, so I'm still in core. But just building on some of the comments that were made about using the pinup as a place for also the delivery of an argument or a paper in other courses, I wonder if we can't think about the idea of that kind of happening in reverse, and the fact that we have a platform for student work that might motivate a certain approach in studio. It's called Platform, where students see themselves potentially as a contributor or somebody who's selected for that kind of publication. And I think if there's not a platform for history, and I'm saying history, history and theory, or history, that is also separate from this idea of design research, then what are master's students potentially motivated to contribute to? And so there's a lack of a platform, maybe, or maybe I'm missing, maybe it exists already.
I had one thing that, sorry. Oh, thank you. No, it's just, I don't mean to be a troublemaker, but as Timothy mentioned, yeah, I've done a lot of work with Tony Grafton, thus I've been fairly intensively involved with the history of the book for many years. And after many years in seminar of trying to model a way of approaching the text with students and the materiality of book culture, I have to say, I was in seminar one day and Platform had just come out. And the students were studying Platform like it was the Talmud. I mean, which kid is on page 6? Which kid is in color? Where are the captions? I've never seen such a hermeneutic of suspicion applied to a text. So I just want to say Platform has its own second task in school. Yeah.
Andrea?
Thank you. Responding to, a couple of comments. My background is in architecture, and right now I'm doing the master in landscape architecture, so addressing also in this table landscape architecture as in history and theory, I think is important. But also responding to Michael's questions before, I have also seen a lack of interest in students in going into history classes. They are required, but I think they don't know the fact that they can use that as a design tool, because it hasn't been addressed, and that's my personal thing that I do in my office, and my friends know that I use history and theory as a way of including that in my own proposals, ideas, and designs. And so I don't know any here in this school, because I haven't taken classes in architecture, but I do want to know, Jorge, perhaps if you try to teach students history as a way of using precedents, and how that can be, through a process of transformation, they can start building their own design ideas. And perhaps, Sonia, in history of landscape architecture, first students really need to know the difference between the class of theory of landscape architecture and the class of history of landscape architecture. They spend a lot of time in the studio, and they just decide not to go to these classes that are extremely important. And I agree, it shouldn't be like historians serving the designers, but it should be perhaps the other way around, or simply not to separate all these ideas and to think that criticism, history, and theory is a design process.
I think the use of precedent in the studio, I wouldn't say it's generalized, but it's fairly well use technique, pedagogical moment in the studio used by many, many teachers, and I don't think there is a lot of controversy about that. I think students learned a lot, but to me, what we need to try to produce and foster is what I was, this is the thing I was going to talk about at the end, but just to make it shorter, is what works is in the studio, proximity, exposure to and experimentation with historical material. And that is a strategy. I mean, it's not necessarily an overall method that you can use sometimes, and it might be part of what you're interested in. I'm being described is so interesting, the things that happen to yourself in a school. Now, apparently I'm an expert in conservation, which I never in my life. But probably comes because I found that, as we did in the studio in which we worked together in parallel with Erica, I found that working with a found object of certain historical value, that there is a certain quality as part of the project that you really need to make it part of something else that you do, is an indirect way, so you were talking about that is incredibly successful. To engage in the making by necessity with history and with where these things, with the ruins or another building or your neighbor or expansion, it has its own tradition as a pedagogy, I think, and we have many cases. I think the studio in the core has used that sometimes. And I just find that to be definitely something that works. Again, I repeat, this sort of proximity and exposure to and experimentation with historical material in the studio is definitely something that works, and it also forces students and teachers to seek help from historians of architecture. And so that's one thing. I have one, if you allow me to go into a figure. James. No, I was going to present my fantasy because I think it gives something to think about.
You have slides?
No. But I'm going to read so it goes faster, but I'm an average but well-trained musician. From age 7 to 19, I studied every single day of my life music, while doing all the other things that kids and adolescents do. I had a phenomenal teacher, my second mom, I remember. I used to think that's her. She was a real tyrant. Her name was Severina, which means severe. As music teachers are supposed to be harsh when I made mistakes or not do proper practice, or overly loving, too much kissing and hugging whenever I did it right. I did all that a normal music performance pianist do. It was not until much later in my life that I realized that I had learned the history of music in depth without ever having taken a course or read a book about the history of music. If you did your homework, you learned the history without effort, in a total state of unawareness that it existed. To learn how to play, you progress by learning how to play what today would be called a canon, but in a very particular way. As you progress, which has nothing to do with the chronology of progress in the history of music, you accumulated knowledge about structure, composition, counterpoint, melody, tonality, atonality, etc., etc. And one day, suddenly, almost like an epiphany, you got it all well in order and with clarity. Causality and relationships all reveal themselves. Of course, JSB, as we used to call him, is at the foundation of everything. No way you could explain Mahler without Wagner. you could detect, anticipate, and listen to the echoes of Haydn in Beethoven, even if you learned them in the wrong order. More importantly, though, the canon, let's say the German canon of Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, Mahler, Schoenberg, suddenly was both indispensable and also very flexible, malleable, and even disposable. But even more reassuring, it was a joy to discover that all the others that you had liked, musicians that you had liked in secret all along in popular music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Aretha Franklin, Patsy Cline, etc., had had the same experience. Recently, I saw Smokey Robinson on TV reminiscing about how he's becoming a Motown idol started in his childhood in his house, where his mother rehearsed in the piano the music they played at church on Sundays. Her two sisters used the same instrument to progress in their proper strict studies of classical music. Specifically, he mentioned Bach, Beethoven, and Chopin, while he loved jazz and blues, and all of them sang at church on Sundays. They were somehow learning the history of music as I did without knowing, and it was clear in the way he spoke that he also knew it. Designing architecture is not a performing art, so this is the end of my fantasy, made impossible wish as to how to deal with our problem today. But there is something to take from this image of learning of music history by performing. For practitioners, and by that I'm evoking the moment of the studio in school, what count is, and I'll finish what I was saying earlier, proximity, exposure to, and experimentation with historical material. There is more, but I stop there. And to me, it's always been very inspiring, this idea of learning by doing, learning history also by reconstructing a system, by accumulations of acts of making. I think music and the performing arts are very special in that sense, because in order to learn your métier, you actually have to reenact the pieces, but I do think it's something to ponder and think about. And that's what I said.
Okay, with that.
Okay.
Okay, that was a very musical and romantic notion of history. Thank you very much. So we'd better end with
It
that.
is romantic.
Thank you.